The fog rolled in thick over the Aleutian Islands, the kind of fog that swallowed sound, erased horizons, and made even the sky feel like a trapped room. For most pilots, it was a nightmare. For the Japanese, it was cover. For the Americans, it was ignorance. But on June 4th, 1942, something happened in that icy wasteland that would rewrite the entire air war in the Pacific. A Japanese fighter, feared Mitsubishi A6M Zero, veered out of formation during a raid over the island of Akutan. Its pilot, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, was just 19 years old. Fresh-faced, skilled, loyal. He believed the Zero was invincible. Every Japanese pilot did. Every American pilot feared it, and with good reason. For the first 6 months of World War II, the Zero had humiliated every aircraft it met. It turned tighter, climbed faster, and outdueled anything the Allies threw at it. Against the thin-skinned wildcats and buffaloes, the Zero sliced through formations like a blade through paper. Pilots reported it doing the impossible, hanging on its propeller, drifting sideways, climbing like a homesick angel. No Allied aircraft could match it. No intelligence reports could explain it. The Zero was a phantom, deadly, mysterious, and untouchable. But on that foggy day, fate intervened. Koga's Zero, hit by ground fire, began leaking oil. He had been trained for emergencies, but the Aleutians were not home. He began searching for a landing spot. His wingmen signaled to him, "Ditch in the water. Better to sink the aircraft than let the enemy touch it. Better to die with honor." But Koga thought he saw a flat meadow, solid ground. He lowered his landing gear. He committed. He was wrong. The meadow was a bog, soft, wet, deceptive. When the Zero touched down, its wheels dug deep. The plane flipped forward, and the cockpit slammed into the mud with a violent crack. Koga was killed instantly. His wingmen circled overhead, horrified. Protocol demanded they destroy the aircraft, burn it, bomb it, deny it to the enemy at all costs. But the fog closed in. American anti-aircraft fire intensified. They were forced to retreat, leaving the most precious aircraft in the Japanese arsenal sitting untouched in an Alaskan swamp. For 3 weeks, the Zero sat there, fully intact, the most advanced fighter in the East, frozen in silence. Then, on July 10, 1942, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina flying boat spotted something unusual in the marsh. An aircraft, not American, not crashed beyond recognition, but whole. The crew radioed the discovery. What they found was beyond anything the Allies had dared to hope for. Plane was almost pristine, the wings unbroken, the fuselage perfect, the engine intact. Even the paint still shined under the mud. A complete, untouched Zero, one of the most guarded secrets of the Japanese Empire, sitting in front of them like a gift from the heavens. The Americans had captured enemy aircraft before, usually burned wreckage, twisted metal, scraps that revealed nothing. But this was a miracle. They carefully extracted it from the bog, loaded it onto a barge, and shipped it south to the United States. Every officer who saw it knew exactly what it meant. The Allies now held the enemy's most powerful weapon in their hands. The Zero was taken to the North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego, a place soon to become the center of one of the most important intelligence breakthroughs of the entire war. Its arrival was top secret. The hangar was sealed. Guards were posted. Only select engineers and test pilots were allowed inside. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, a test pilot with nerves of steel and instincts sharper than any manual. He didn't just fly planes, he understood them. He could feel strengths through the rudder pedals and weaknesses through the control stick. His orders were simple: find out why the Zero was so deadly and how to kill it. When Sanders first sat in the cockpit, he immediately noticed something shocking. The Zero was light, too light, dangerously light. It had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no structural reinforcements. The Japanese had built a champion, but one made of glass. Sanders taxied it out. The aircraft was responsive, twitchy, eager. It felt alive in his hands. On his first flight, he discovered the truth that American pilots had been dying to know. The Zero was unbeatable, unless you knew its weaknesses. It could outturn anything, but it couldn't roll quickly. It couldn't dive steeply at high speeds. Its engine choked above high altitudes. Its wings shook violently in fast dives. Its controls stiffened at over 250 knots. Its fuel tanks were floating bombs, and its pilot sat in a cockpit with almost no protection. For the first time, the Americans understood the Zero was not invincible. It was fragile, and that single truth would alter the air air war forever. Sanders compiled a list of weaknesses, ones the Japanese never imagined Americans would know. He wrote the new doctrine: never dogfight a Zero. Dive and run. Hit in one pass. Use speed, use altitude, use armor. These tactics, born from a crashed plane in a frozen swamp, would soon save thousands of pilots, because the Americans now knew something the Japanese could never take back. The Zero could be beaten.
When the Akutan Zero arrived at North Island Naval Air Station, the hangar doors slammed shut behind it like a vault sealing a treasure. No reporters, no photographs, no public acknowledgement. Even most officers on the base were kept in the dark. What lay inside that hangar was the most valuable piece of enemy hardware captured in the entire Pacific War. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but their greatest advantage had just slipped into American hands. Engineers gathered around the aircraft like surgeons around a patient. They studied the fuselage, panels, rivets, and joints in complete silence. Right away, something stood out. The Zero was astonishingly lightweight. It weighed nearly 2,000 pounds less than an American Wildcat. It had thin skin, aluminum like paper, no armor plating around the cockpit, no bulletproof glass, no self-sealing fuel tanks. This aircraft had been designed with a single philosophy: absolute agility at the cost of everything else, even survival. American engineers could hardly believe that the Japanese had sacrificed so much for maneuverability. It was brilliant, it was reckless, and it explained why the Zero could outturn anything in the sky. But what they discovered next was even more important. Only one man was cleared to fly it: Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders, the Navy's top test pilot. Sanders approached the Zero with the calm of a man who has flown everything and fears nothing. As he climbed into the cockpit, he noted the cramped space, the thin seat, the exposed fuel lines running along the pilot's legs. He later wrote, "It was a beautiful aircraft until you realized what it cost the man flying it." On September 20th, 1942, Sanders took the Akutan Zero into the air for the first time. What happened over the next 25 minutes changed the war. Once airborne, Sanders pushed the Zero through a full series of maneuvers: climbs, turns, dives, rolls. He already knew the Zero was agile, but he was shocked at just how limited it truly was in high-speed combat. He discovered several critical weaknesses. 1. Terrible roll rate at high speed. Above 200 knots, the Zero's aileron stiffened like frozen hinges. Its roll rate collapsed. A P-40 or F-4F could easily roll out of danger. A Zero couldn't follow. 2. Use speed, not turns. Sanders confirmed what many frontline pilots had suspected but couldn't prove: never turn with a Zero. Use hit-and-run tactics instead. Diving attacks, not dogfights. 3. It hated high altitudes. The Zero's engine lacked a supercharger. Above 20,000 feet, it was gasping for power. American planes performed better the higher they went. The Zero performed worse. 4. Fuel tanks were inferno traps. Sanders fired at the Zero's fuel tanks on the ground using test rigs. One tracer round, just one, turned it into a fireball. Suddenly, American pilots had the answer to a deadly riddle. The Zero didn't dominate because it was invincible. It dominated because American pilots had been fighting it the wrong way. Sanders and the engineering team wrote a classified report titled Preliminary Report, Japanese Fighter Type Zero. Inside were the instructions that would transform the entire Pacific Air War. Here were the key orders sent to squadrons. 1. Never engage in a turning fight with a Zero. It will outturn you every time. 2. Use tolerance for high-speed dives. American aircraft could dive where the Zero would break apart. 3. Use armor to your advantage. A Zero pilot had almost no protection. One good burst could end the fight. 4. Boom and zoom attacks. Dive, fire, climb away. Never linger. 5. Fight at high altitude whenever possible. You are strongest where the Zero is weakest. These tactics were immediately tested in mock battles between the captured Zero and American fighters, P-40s, Wildcats, Airacobras. Pilots who once had feared the Zero now dominated it. One pilot wrote, "We were finally fighting the Zero on our own terms, not theirs." The psychological effect was enormous. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots had confidence. The Navy issued strict warnings. No pilot was to mention the captured Zero. No photographs were allowed outside intelligence offices. No one was permitted to discuss its weaknesses in public. The Japanese had no idea their aircraft had been compromised, and that ignorance would cost them dearly. Because the data from the Akutan Zero didn't just help in dogfights. It inspired new American planes. The F6 Hellcat, which would go on to destroy more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter in history, was fine-tuned using the Zero's weaknesses as a blueprint. The Hellcat wasn't designed to match the Zero. It was designed to kill it. By late 1942, the effects were already being felt. American pilots over Guadalcanal began using the new Zero killer tactics. Losses dropped. Kill ratios surged. The Japanese command was confused. Why were the Americans suddenly fighting differently? Why were once easy victories turning into crushing defeats? They assumed new American aircraft had arrived. They were wrong. It wasn't new aircraft. It was new knowledge. Knowledge gained from a single, muddy, inverted fighter in a forgotten Alaskan swamp. A crashed Zero that changed the fate of the air war.
The engineers of the U.S. Navy's Intelligence Center, NAS North Island, knew one thing the moment they secured the Akutan Zero. This was no ordinary aircraft. This was the plane that had humiliated the West in 1941-42, and now it sat in their hangar, stripped, silent, waiting to be dissected. When they removed the cowling and inspected the frames, the engineers paused. The Zero weighed almost 2,000 pounds less than comparable American fighters. But how? They tapped on the internal walls. It sounded hollow, too hollow. No armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no heavy reinforcements. The Japanese had made one brutal calculation. Speed is armor. Agility is survival. Weight is the enemy. If a pilot got hit, he died. If the plane got hit, it burned. But if it didn't get hit, it could dance in the sky like nothing the world had ever seen. The Americans had always assumed Japanese aircraft were cheap copies of European designs. This crash proved the opposite. The Zero wasn't cheap, it was purpose-built for dominance. When an engineer tried to lift the wingtip, he stumbled. The wing bent, like a longbow. Not weak, flexible. The Zero's wings worked almost like a bird's. In high-speed turns, they flexed and absorbed stress instead of snapping. This was why Zeros could make impossible climbing turns, why American fighters stalled trying to follow, why dogfights always ended the same way in 1941. The Zero behind, the American plane on fire. The American officers expected a complex, high-tech engine. They didn't get one. The Nakajima Sakae 12 was shockingly simple for its performance, but it had one genius engineering decision. It was optimized for mid-altitude maneuverability, not high-altitude speed. This explained everything. Zeros dominated at low and medium altitudes, but they struggled above 20,000 feet. American pilots had never realized this. Now they knew exactly where the Zero was strongest
and where it was weakest. During the test flights, Lieutenant Saunders noticed something bizarre. At certain speeds, the controls felt smooth, almost too smooth, like the plane was gliding on rails. Then, just a bit faster, the controls stiffened abruptly. That was the key. The Zero could turn inside any Allied fighter as long as the pilot kept it in its sweet spot. Push it too fast, and the plane became stiff. Push it even faster, and the wings could tear. The Zero wasn't built for dives. This discovery would rewrite American dogfighting doctrine. One test pilot pushed the Zero into a steep dive. At 300 miles per hour, the controls froze. Not stiff, locked. The plane simply refused to respond. This was the moment that changed everything. American pilots now had the blueprint for survival. Never turn with the Zero. Dive. Dive straight down and force the Zero to follow. It couldn't. A P-40, P-38, F-4X, any American fighter could escape by punching the nose down and throttling forward. A simple tactic, a life-saving one, and the Japanese had no idea. After weeks of testing, the engineers compiled the famous Akutan Zero report. It revealed the Zero's turning superiority, its catastrophic lack of armor, its fragile control surfaces at high speeds, its inability to dive, its altitude limitations, its predictable sweet spot maneuvering zone, and its reliance on lightweight design over survivability. This report landed on Admiral Nimitz's desk. Within weeks, every air unit in the Pacific had the same message: do not dogfight the Zero, outdive it, boom and zoom it, hit it fast, hit it once, get out. The Americans finally had the playbook they needed, and Japan had lost the one thing it relied on: the illusion of invincibility.
The Akutan Zero didn't stay a secret for long. Within weeks, its weaknesses were spread across briefing rooms, carrier decks, and jungle airstrips throughout the Pacific. What had once been whispered myths about the Zero's supernatural maneuverability was now hard science. American pilots had a new doctrine: never turn with a Zero, climb high, hit once, dive out. This chapter is where the transformation begins, where terrified American pilots started fighting back and winning. The Marines at Henderson Field were outnumbered, undersupplied, and exhausted. Before the Akutan Zero findings, every incoming dogfight felt like a death lottery. Zeros controlled the sky. American planes, F6F Wildcats, were slower, heavier, and far less agile. But this time, they had a strategy. When the Japanese raid approached Henderson, the Wildcat squadron didn't scramble low and try to turn fight. They climbed, straight up, high altitude, exactly where the Zero lost efficiency. Then they dove. 10 Wildcats shot downward like thrown spears, picking their targets with precision. A Zero swerved to evade, but it couldn't roll fast enough. Its wings stiffened, exactly as the engineers predicted. The American pilots didn't stay to celebrate their hits. They dove straight down into the jungle haze, a maneuver the Zero couldn't match without losing control. In that single engagement, the kill ratio flipped. For the first time in the Pacific, American pilots walked back to their tents smiling. The myth had cracked. Lieutenant Commander John Tatch had invented the maneuver months earlier, but now, armed with the Akutan data, it became a lethal Zero killer. The tactic was simple genius. 2 American planes flew side by side. If a Zero tried to tail one, the 2 allies crossed paths. Each one ended up pointing at the Zero from opposite angles. The Zero pilot, forced to turn tightly to keep his target, slowed down, entered the stiff zone, became predictable. Then he died. What was once a clumsy improvisation became a systematic trap, because pilots now knew exactly how the Zero would respond. Tatch later said, "We didn't outfly the Zero, we outthought it." By early 1943, American pilots fought with a confidence that would have been unthinkable a year ago. During the Bismarck Sea engagements, Japanese bombers were escorted by dozens of Zeros. Old 1942 tactics would have ended in disaster, but now, American P-38 Lightnings attacked in vertical dives. The moment a Zero tried to follow, it stalled, or broke formation, or snapped a control surface. Japanese pilots began avoiding dives entirely, staying high and defensive, exactly what American strategists hoped for. With the escorts paralyzed, U.S. bombers destroyed the Japanese convoy in one of the most one-sided massacres of the Pacific Air War. In 1941 and early 1942, the word Zero meant instant panic. Pilots described its arrival like a ghost that appeared behind you no matter what you did. But after the Akutan Zero tests, that fear dissolved. Pilots began saying, "If a Zero gets on your tail, dive. If it turns with you, smile. He's already dead." That mental shift mattered more than technology. When men believe they can survive, they fight differently. They become predators instead of prey. Japan assumed the Zero's early dominance meant it would stay dominant forever. They never upgraded the armor, never improved the dive capabilities, never replaced the fragile wing design, never modernized the engine. By 1943, the Zero was the same plane it had been on Pearl Harbor Day. But the Americans? They were now flying with superior tactics, better training, detailed technical intelligence, newer planes optimized specifically to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. The P-38, F6 Hellcat, and F-4U Corsair were built with one mission: kill the Zero. And they did. On October 5, 1943, over Wake Island, Hellcat pilots encountered dozens of Zeros, but the outcome was already written. The Hellcats didn't try to dogfight. They used vertical dives, high-speed passes, hit-and-run attacks, coordinated weaves, and altitude advantage, exactly as the Akutan intelligence recommended. By the end of the day, Japan lost 35 planes. The Americans lost 1, a ratio that would define the rest of the Pacific War. By late 1942, American engineers had seen enough. The intelligence pooled from the Akutan Zero revealed every strength and every fatal flaw the Japanese fighter possessed. And the U.S. Navy wanted a new aircraft, fast. Not just an upgrade, not just a replacement, but a weapon designed with one purpose: beat the Zero at everything it was good at, and destroy it at everything it was bad at. This is the story of how a single crashed plane reshaped American aviation and gave birth to one of the deadliest fighters of World War II, the F6F Hellcat. Before the Hellcat, U.S. Navy pilots relied on the F4F Wildcat. It was tough, durable, and reliable, but it wasn't enough. Against the Zero, the Wildcat climbed slower, turned slower, accelerated slower, lost energy faster, struggled in vertical maneuvers. The only thing it had going for it was survivability. Wildcats could take a beating the Zero never could. But by mid-1942, intelligence officers and pilots agreed. America needed a brand new fighter, something built for dominance, not survival. When engineers at Grumman Aircraft analyzed the recovered Zero, they saw the opportunity of a lifetime. The Akutan report highlighted the Zero's 3 fatal weaknesses. 1. Slow roll rate at high speeds. 2. Fragile construction, couldn't take hits. 3. Weak engine response above 15,000 feet. Grumman had one question:
What if we design a plane that attacks only where the Zero can't fight? Their goal wasn't to match the Zero turn for turn. It was to create a predator with faster dives, higher top speed, heavier guns, stronger armor, superior climb, and durable construction. A plane that could survive getting hit, then hit back 10 times harder. The first prototype rolled out in June 1942, a rushed, aggressive design. It looked like a Wildcat on steroids. Bigger wings, larger fuselage, a monster engine, better visibility, rugged landing gear. But something was missing. It was still too slow, too tame. Then, the engineers got an idea made possible by one crashed Zero. The intelligence crews explained that the Zero's biggest weakness was power. Its lightweight engine wasn't built for high speeds, steep climbs, or explosive acceleration. Grumman made a bold decision. Replace the engine with the most powerful piston engine America had, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP. The same engine used in the P-47 Thunderbolt, the heaviest fighter of the war. This upgrade changed everything. The Hellcat now had 2,000-plus horsepower, a blistering top speed of 380 miles per hour. Climb performance the Zero could never match, and dive speeds the Zero couldn't survive without breaking apart. The Hellcat had become what U.S. Navy pilots later called a Zero-killing machine. When test pilot Bob Hall took the Hellcat up for combat testing against a captured Zero, observers held their breath. What they saw stunned them. At low speeds, the Zero still turned tighter, but everything else was different. The Hellcat could climb above it, outdive it, outrun it, outshoot it, outsurvive it, and outroll it at high speeds. Every advantage the Zero had early in the war was gone. A U.S. Navy officer watching the tests wrote, "If a pilot flies the Hellcat properly, he has no business losing to a Zero." On August 31, 1943, VF-5 Squadron launched the first Hellcat combat mission. Within minutes, the Hellcat shot down Zeros without a single American loss. Pilots who once dreaded facing Zeros now spoke with confidence. We finally have the right tool for the job. By mid-1944, the kill ratios were absurd. One Hellcat lost for every 19 Zeros destroyed. More than 75% of all Navy aerial victories were scored by Hellcats. The plane shot down over 5,000 enemy aircraft. The Zero, once feared, was now prey. Japan's most advanced fighter was undone not by a fleet, not by a general, not by a strategy, but by a plane that crashed on a tiny island in Alaska. A single accident, a single discovery, a single moment of luck. The Akutan Zero became the blueprint that ended the Zero's reign and gave the Allies the aircraft they needed to dominate the Pacific skies.
The Akutan Zero didn't just help the Americans build better aircraft. It exposed something far deeper, a structural weakness in Japan's entire war machine, a weakness no amount of courage, training, or sacrifice could overcome. This chapter isn't about one plane. It's about the entire strategy that collapsed once the Zero's secrets became known. In 1941, Japanese commanders believed the Zero was unbeatable. And at first, they were right. American pilots were outmaneuvered, outclimbed, outturned, outgunned. The Zero dominated the skies from China to Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Japan made a critical mistake. They assumed this dominance would last the entire war. So instead of improving the aircraft, they doubled down on the existing design. They built more Zeros, but not better ones. While the U.S. adapted rapidly, Japan stayed frozen in 1941. Before the crash, the Zero's performance seemed supernatural. After the crash, it became predictable. The Akutan intelligence report outlined exact stall speeds, dive limits, roll weaknesses, structural vulnerabilities, turning thresholds, armor deficiencies. Suddenly, the mystery was gone. A U.S. Navy officer wrote in 1942, "The aura of invincibility around the Zero evaporated the moment we read the report." Japan didn't just lose secrecy, they lost fear as a weapon. Even when Japan finally realized the Zero needed upgrades, it was too late. Japan lacked aluminum resources, mass production capability, large modern factories, advanced engine technology, high-octane fuel. The U.S. had factories producing 500 planes a day. Japan struggled to build 120 a month. The result? America kept sending new aircraft, Hellcats, Corsairs, P-38s, while Japan was still producing the same Zero from 1940. This imbalance wasn't just technical, it was destiny. Early in the war, the Zero was flown by Japan's elite naval aviators. These were men trained for years, hand-picked from the best. But Japan made two devastating mistakes. No rotation policy. Their best pilots stayed in combat until they died. And training program too long to replace them. It took 700-plus flight hours to create a Zero pilot in 1941. By 1943, those aces were gone. Their replacements had less than 100 flight hours, almost no dogfight training, minimal gunnery practice, poor formation discipline. Meanwhile, American pilots grew stronger. Better training, better survival rates, better aircraft, better tactics. The skill gap inverted. The Zero didn't just lose its pilots, it lost the only thing that made it dangerous. When Hellcats entered the Pacific in late 1943, the effect was immediate and brutal. Japan wasn't losing air superiority. They were losing air existence. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944, the famous Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcats destroyed over 300 Japanese planes, losing fewer than 30 American fighters. Many Japanese pilots never even saw the Americans before dying. The Zero's weaknesses, once minor, now became fatal. It couldn't dive to escape. Wings tore at high speed. Engine underpowered at altitude. Fuel tanks unprotected. No armor, poor roll rate. The Akutan discoveries predicted this outcome exactly. By late 1944, Japanese command understood the truth. The Zero could no longer survive in the sky, so they made a terrible decision. They turned the Zero into a suicide aircraft. A fighter once feared for its agility was now valued only for how well it could crash into an American ship. This was the Zero's final humiliation, a symbol of a strategy broken beyond repair. Even without the Akutan crash, the Zero had no future. Its design philosophy, lightweight, no armor, was brilliant in 1940, but suicidal against an enemy with industrial power like America. The Akutan Zero didn't create Japan's downfall, it accelerated it. It told the Americans exactly what to do, and the Americans did it fast. The story of that lone crashed fighter is the story of the Pacific Air War, the end of Japanese air superiority, the rise of American aviation, the birth of the Hellcat, the shift in pilot confidence, the collapse of Japanese strategy, and most importantly, how one accident changed the fate of nations.
History remembers the Akutan Zero as a piece of machinery, a broken Japanese fighter lying in a marsh. But the real story is human. This chapter is about the men who found it, recovered it, rebuilt it, and transformed its secrets into America's most decisive aerial advantage of WW2. Without these people, the Zero would have remained a deadly mystery. Instead, it became the blueprint for defeating Japan. The story begins with a man who never intended to change history. Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga. Age 19. Unit Tainan Air Group. Aircraft Mitsubishi A6M Zero, serial 4593. On June 4, 1942, the day of the Aleutian raids, Koga Zero was hit by American ground fire. The damage was minor but fatal. His fuel line was leaking. Instead of ditching at sea, Koga attempted an emergency landing on Akutan Island, believing the grassland would support his wheels. But Akutan wasn't grassland. It was a swamp. The Zero flipped upside down, killing him instantly. His wingmen were ordered not to burn the plane, believing Koga might still be alive. That decision was the single greatest intelligence gift America received in the Pacific War. A man loyal to Japan had unknowingly handed the United States the weapon that would defeat his own Air Force. 5 weeks later, on July 10, 1942, a PBY Catalina patrol plane flew over Akutan Island. A crewman spotted something blue-gray glinting in the sunlight. The crew consisted of Lieutenant Robert K. Larson, pilot, Lieutenant William Thies, navigator, Chief Aviation Mechanics Mate Paul Foley, observer, Corporal Albert Knack, gunner. Foley shouted, "There's a Jap plane down there." They flew low, dangerously low, circling the wreck until they were certain. A Zero, intact, untouched, and not burned. Larson immediately radioed the report that would ignite an intelligence frenzy throughout the Navy. The men had no idea they had just found the most valuable aircraft in the Pacific War. Recovering the Zero was no simple task. Akutan was near Japanese patrol zones, foggy, isolated, and filled with marsh pits that swallowed equipment whole. The salvage crew included Lieutenant Robert K. Ness, engineering officer, Chief Aviation Machinist Mate John Murphy, lead mechanic, Carpenter Mate First Class Arthur McDaniel, rigger, dozens of Seabees and Navy workers. Working under constant threat of Japanese air attack, they hauled materials across mud, jacked up the inverted Zero, disassembled its wings, reinforced the fuselage, built makeshift rails to drag it across the swamp, loaded it onto a barge. What should have taken days took weeks. But on July 26, 1942, covered in mud and seaweed, the salvaged Akutan Zero left the island. A wreck to some, a revelation to the people who understood its value. At Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, a group of mechanics and engineers stared at the battered plane in disbelief. Among them, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, Chief Test Pilot, Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatt, fighter tactics expert, Grumman engineers, and Navy Bureau of Aeronautics analysts. Piece by piece, they restored the Zero, straightened the airframe, repaired the control surfaces, rewired the cockpit, fixed the landing gear, replaced damaged instruments. By September 1942, the plane was ready. On September 20, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders climbed into the cockpit. He had only one mission: find out how to kill a Zero. Over the next several weeks, Sanders performed acceleration tests, climb performance trials, high-speed rolls, stall tests, dive tests, and turning circle measurements. His reports became legendary. Above 200 knots, the Zero becomes sluggish. Above 250, it becomes helpless. It cannot follow a dive without risking structural failure. Roll rate poor above medium speeds. Advantage to American fighters. Armor non-existent. These findings rewrote every American tactic in the Pacific.
Armed with Sanders tests, pilots like Commander John Fatch and Commander James Flatt and Lieutenant Commander Charles Swede-Vetas rewrote U.S. Navy air doctrine. They built training programs around the Zero's weaknesses: boom and zoom attacks, high-speed slashing attacks, vertical maneuvers, coordinated teamwork, the thatch weave, dive escapes. American pilots no longer feared the Zero, they understood it. Knowledge became their most powerful weapon. Every battle after 1942, Guadalcanal, Wake, Rabaul, the Marianas, was shaped by the work of a Japanese pilot who made a fatal decision, a patrol crew that followed a glint in the grass, a salvage team that refused to quit, engineers who restored the impossible, test pilots who pushed a captured enemy plane to its limits, tacticians who turned data into dominance. The Akutan Zero wasn't just a wreck. It was a triumph of teamwork, intelligence, and adaptation. It proved that wars aren't only won by weapons, but by people who know how to use information better than their enemy.
When historians talk about major intelligence breakthroughs of World War II, they often mention Enigma, Bletchley Park, or the breaking of Japanese naval codes. But there's one story that stands beside them, equal in impact, but born from pure accident. The Akutan Zero. A single crash, a single pilot, a single decision not to burn the wreck. And because of that, the entire trajectory of the Pacific Air War changed. This final chapter explains why the Akutan Zero is considered one of the most valuable intelligence finds in aviation history, and how its legacy shaped strategy, engineering, and victory itself. In early 1942, American pilots didn't truly understand the enemy aircraft they were fighting. They only knew fear. Reports from survivors described the Zero as turning inside any plane we have, climbing like a homesick angel, appearing out of nowhere, impossible to shake off your tail, bullet that could change directions mid-air. Pilots believed the Zero could do anything. Some even thought it ran on oxygen injection, or special fuel, or secret Japanese engineering magic. Because the Zero had never been captured intact, it existed as a myth. And myths destroy morale far more effectively than machines. The Akutan Zero wreck turned the impossible into the measurable. Every secret, from the thickness of its skin to the limits of its engine, was now in American hands. The intelligence gleaned wasn't vague or speculative, it was absolute truth. The findings changed combat tactics, aircraft design, formation strategies, maintenance doctrines, training programs, fleet deployment, strategic planning. For the first time, the Americans weren't reacting to Zero attacks, they were predicting them. This transformed the Pacific Air War from improvisation into calculation. From the Akutan tests came a list that would shape the next generation of fighters. Must have superior roll rate at high speeds. Must dive faster without structural limits. Must carry armor the Zero lacked. Must protected fuel tanks. Must climb as well or better. Must overpower Zero at 20,000 feet. Must use firepower that cripples lightly armored planes. Must use robust landing gear for carrier strikes. This checklist directly influenced F6 Hellcat, F4 Corsair, P-38 Lightning, P-47 Thunderbolt. The U.S. didn't just design new planes, it designed Zero killers. The Zero's famed strengths, tight turns, lightweight agility, extreme low-speed control, became liabilities once Americans knew how to manipulate them. Tactics were built specifically to lure the Zero into using its strengths and punish it for them. Turn tightly, lose speed, lose roll control, become target. Dive after enemy, wings risk tearing off. Pilot can't follow. Hold vertical climb, engine loses power, stall is inevitable. Every advantage became a doorway into defeat. This is what happens when knowledge replaces fear. Fear is a weapon, and the Zero wielded it ruthlessly in the first months of the war. But after the Akutan intelligence was distributed, American pilots spoke differently. They walked differently. They fought differently.
They knew they could outrun the Zero. They could outdive it. They could outclimb it with new planes. They could kill it at high speeds. They could survive hits that would shred a Zero. The shift was profound. A pilot who believes he can win flies boldly. A pilot who fears he will die flies cautiously. The Zero lost the psychological battle before it ever lost the physical one. With American pilots gaining the upper hand, things began changing on a grand scale. 1. American carriers pushed deeper into enemy territory. Confidence in air superiority allowed bolder naval maneuvers. 2. Bombing campaigns became more effective. Escorts could now protect bomber groups against Zero swarms. 3. Japanese shipping lanes became death traps. P-38s and Hellcats hunted Zeros until the convoy skies were empty. 4. The Zero forced Japan into a corner, ultimately leading to kamikaze tactics. When the Zero failed in air combat, its only remaining use was suicide attacks. 5. The U.S. accelerated mass production of Zero killers, turning the tide into an unstoppable tidal wave. The Akutan Zero crash didn't just affect battles. It altered strategy from top to bottom. The Akutan Zero teaches one of the most important lessons in military history. The moment you stop improving, you start losing. Japan built an incredible aircraft in 1940, but they froze it in time. America adapted, and adaptation wins wars. The recovered Zero showed that no weapon is invincible, no design perfect, no advantage permanent. With intelligence, innovation, and relentless analysis, even the greatest enemy can be undone. When the Akutan Zero crashed upside down in that lonely marsh, no one imagined it would become the basis for the Hellcat, the end of Japanese air dominance, the blueprint for new tactics, the turning point of the air war, one of the most valuable aircraft ever captured intact, and a symbol of how wars are won through brains as much as bravery. From a swamp in Alaska to the skies over the Marianas, its influence spread wider than any bullet ever fired. Its destruction birthed American air superiority. Its secrets reshaped aviation history. And its story remains one of the most extraordinary examples of how a single accident can rewrite the fate of nations.